The radar dish stopped making its low grinding hum sometime last Thursday or Wednesday. I've been losing track of the specific days, the generator cycle, the wind, the nothing outside the fence. It all starts blurring into one long continuous thing after a while. I'm up in the observation post right now, second floor of the main operations building, window that faces northeast. There are binoculars hanging on a nail I drove into the windowsill sometime in week 2, and I find myself reaching for them every hour or so without deciding to. Just reach. Look, put them back. Right now I'm looking at the tree line. There's one out there that I've been watching for going on 11 days. It's about 300 yards past the outer fence line, standing at the edge of the spruce trees where the ground starts sloping uphill. Every morning, more or less around the same time, and I say more or less because I can't be sure it's the exact same time, I just notice it when I notice it. It's there, standing still, facing the facility. I told myself it doesn't know anything, doesn't see me, doesn't sense the station, that it's just standing there because something, maybe the hum of the dish back when it still worked, maybe the faint vibration the backup generator gives off, maybe just the geometry of the terrain, keeps drawing it back to that same patch of ground. I still believe all of that, logically, but it's been 11 days of watching this thing stand there, and I'll tell you, knowing something rationally and feeling it are two pretty different experiences. Let me back up. My name is Garrett Fletcher, 38 years old. I spent 11 years maintaining and calibrating radar systems for the Air Force, mostly AN, FPS-type long-range surveillance sets, some AN/TPS portable stuff, a few things I'm still technically not supposed to talk about in detail. I got out in 2015, not for any dramatic reason, just because 11 years felt like enough, and I was tired of living wherever the Air Force decided I should live. I took a contractor gig with a defense electronics company out of Bozeman, Montana, which paid better and let me actually sleep in the same bed for consecutive weeks. The radar station I'm in right now, designation RFS-19 on old Air Force maps, though most people who knew it called it Ridgeline Station, was decommissioned in 1993, sat empty for 31 years. The Air Force held onto the land longer than they needed to, which is standard practice. And then it went into a federal surplus auction in 2021, and basically nobody wanted it, because it's 47 acres in the middle of nowhere in western Montana. The main dish is a rusted-out monument to the Cold War, and the underground levels smell like 3 decades of standing water and old electrical insulation. I paid $240,000 for it. Cash, most of my savings. My ex-wife, we've been divorced since 2018, and I mean that neutrally. She's a fine person. We just ran out of things to talk about. Called me when I told her about the purchase and said, and I'm quoting here, "Garrett, you have bought your own mental illness," which I thought was pretty funny at the time, and I still kind of think is funny, in a different way, now. What she meant was that I'd been talking for years about finding some piece of land that was already structurally hardened. Not because I was like a prepper with a YouTube channel or whatever. I didn't can my own beans or join any forums. I just had a specific, technical understanding of how fragile modern infrastructure actually is. I'd maintained systems that were designed to survive a nuclear first strike, and I knew better than most people how much engineering went into making something actually resilient. And I'd been sitting in normal houses in normal neighborhoods, watching normal infrastructure slowly strain under normal demands and thinking, yeah, this isn't going to last. I'm not trying to make myself sound like some prophet. I was specific about some things and totally wrong about others. I thought the big failure mode was going to be a power grid event, an EMP, or a major cyber attack on grid management systems, or just a cascading failure from infrastructure that had been underfunded and ignored for too long. I never once sat down and thought through pandemic scenarios, never thought through the particular kind of catastrophic social failure that comes with a pathogen that turns human beings into vectors. So I wasn't right in the specific sense, but I was right enough. I bought Ridgeline Station in March of 2022 and spent the next 2 years driving up on weekends and most of my vacation days to work on it. The contractor job was remote most of the week. I was doing system calibration consulting, writing documentation, occasional site visits, which meant I could structure my schedule enough to actually put real work into the place. And there was a lot of work to do. The main operations building was structurally fine. These Cold War-era facilities were built to survive, not just stand. And the concrete walls were 18 inches thick in most places, 30 in the hardened sections. The roof needed work. 2 sections had let in water over the decades, and there was a whole section of ceiling in the secondary comms room that had basically turned into a stalactite farm. The windows were original single pane, and I replaced all of them. The doors were military-spec steel, and they were in pretty good shape considering. The 2 above-ground outbuildings, what the original site plans called Building B and Building C, though I mostly thought of them as the generator shed and the equipment barn, needed more work. The generator shed roof had partially collapsed on the east end. The equipment barn was solid, but had been stripped of everything useful before decommissioning, leaving just empty equipment racks bolted to concrete floors. The underground levels were something else entirely. There were 2 of them. The first level, about 12 feet down, accessible from a stairwell in the main building, had been used for communications and power switching equipment. Most of the original equipment was still there, which surprised me. Racks of old switching gear, cable runs, conduit. Some of it was salvageable. The second level was 22 feet underground and had served as a backup command post during the Cold War's most anxious years. It had its own air handling system, its own water supply connection to a deep well, its own generator hookups. It was designed so that 12 to 15 people could seal themselves in and survive for up to 30 days without any outside support. When I first went down there with a flashlight in spring of 2022, walking through that second level for the first time, feeling the temperature drop with each step down, and seeing the old equipment rails and the bunk frames still bolted to the walls, and the heavy blast doors that hadn't been sealed in decades, I had a feeling I can only describe as recognition. Like seeing something you'd been imagining without knowing you were imagining it. I started working on that second level in summer of 2022. It took me almost 2 years to get it to where I wanted it. I should talk about the warning signs because people, if there are people someday reading this, are going to want to know what I was picking up on and when. And the honest answer is that I was picking up on things that individually were easy to dismiss, but collectively were harder to ignore. It started with the aircraft. I had a handheld aviation scanner I'd brought up to the station partly for professional reasons. I was doing some consulting work related to ATC radar coverage, and having a scanner let me spot-check signal quality in the area, and partly because the site was in a general aviation corridor, and I liked knowing what was going on above me. There's something about knowing your airspace that feels like knowing your neighborhood. Starting in about October of the year before everything fell apart, I noticed gaps, routes that normally had regular small aircraft traffic, 2 or 3 a day, predictable because they were commuter runs between regional airports, started going quiet for days at a time. Not consistently quiet, just occasionally. A route that should have had a Cessna at 10:15 on Tuesday mornings, give or take, would have no Cessna for 2 or 3 weeks, then normal again, then quiet again. I also started monitoring emergency frequencies more closely than I had been, not because I was listening for anything specific. It was just a habit I'd developed in my Air Force years. Keep one ear on the emergency bands, low priority, background awareness. What I heard was a gradual increase in traffic that was hard to quantify, but impossible to miss once you'd been paying attention long enough. More FEMA coordination chatter than was normal for non-hurricane season. More National Guard frequency activity in regions that weren't having any visible crises. I started keeping a log in October. Just a spiral notebook on the workbench in the equipment barn. Dates, times, what I heard or noticed. Nothing dramatic. More like a scientist keeping field notes than a person building a bunker. I also started reading the foreign press more than I usually did. Not because I had any specific tip or lead, just because I'd learned years ago that things that were being minimized in American media coverage sometimes showed up more clearly if you were reading the BBC or Reuters or certain European papers. And in November, there was a cluster of stories about illness events in 3 separate countries that were being described in somewhat oddly careful language. Not outbreak, not spreading. Instead, phrases like localized incidents of violent behavior linked to neurological events, and atypical cases being reviewed by WHO representatives. I'm not a virologist. I'm not a disease specialist of any kind. But the language felt like the language of people who were being careful about what they said, which is different from the language of people who have nothing to hide. In December, I made a decision that at the time felt slightly embarrassing. The kind of thing you do without telling people because you know it sounds nuts. I ordered $8,000 worth of additional food supplies, freeze-dried, long-term storage, the kind of thing that would last 20 years if properly sealed, and drove 4 truckloads of it up to the station over 3 weekends. I filled the second-level storage rooms with it. I also bought a serious medical kit, not just first aid, but a surgery-level kit with IV supplies and antibiotics, and the kind of wound care equipment that's normally only in hospitals, and a second generator to back up the first backup generator, because my philosophy at this point was basically, if 2 is none, what is 3? I called it a precaution. I did not call it anything else, to myself or to anyone who asked. The other thing I did in December, the thing that took the most time and felt the most like something a person who'd lost the plot would do, was work on the perimeter. Ridgeline Station already had a chain-link perimeter fence, 8 feet tall, from its Air Force days, stretched around the whole 47 acres in a rough rectangle. The fence was old but intact. I'd checked the whole thing in my first month of owning the place, and only had to replace about 60 feet of line that had corroded through at the bottom. What it didn't have was adequate signage, adequate lighting, or any kind of secondary deterrent along the inside. I added all 3 over about 6 weekends. Sodium vapor lights on poles at regular intervals, wired into the facility's power grid. A second fence inside the first, along the 2 sides I was most concerned about. The approach from the county road, and the low ground to the south that I figured was the most walkable access route. And between the 2 fences, on both of those priority sides, I ran tripwire at 2 heights. Nothing lethal, just wire that was connected to small bells I hung on the inner fence posts. Yes, bells. Low tech. I know. But the principle is, I don't want an alarm that can fail when the power goes out. I want something mechanical and simple. My contractor boss, a guy named Paul Hennessy, who ran the consulting firm and occasionally did site visits with me, saw the perimeter work when he came up to the station in January for what was supposed to be a joint calibration documentation session. He stood at the fence for a long time without saying anything, and then he said, "Garrett, you doing okay?" I said I was fine, just being practical about property security, because the station was fairly remote and I'd had some concerns about break-ins from people using the area for recreational purposes. He nodded for a while. Then he said, "Is this about the stories going around? The foreign press stuff?" I looked at him. I hadn't told him I'd been reading foreign press. "What stories specifically?" I said. "The thing in, I forget which country, Indonesia? The Philippines? Where there were those attacks and people couldn't explain the behavioral component." "Partly," I said. "Also just general prudence." He nodded again. He didn't say anything else about it, and we went and did the documentation session. But before he left, he stood at the gate for a moment and said, "If something does happen, reach out." I said I would. I haven't heard from Paul since March. I don't know where he is. The first broadcast that made me actually cold, the kind of cold that starts in the middle of your chest and works outward, came in on a Tuesday night in late February. I was down in the first underground level, running a test cycle on the switching gear I'd spent most of January restoring, when I picked it up on the monitoring receiver I'd left running upstairs. I heard it through the floor, faintly, just the rhythm of a voice speaking fast and urgent in a tone that was unmistakably official. I got upstairs in about 30 seconds. It was a FEMA emergency alert going out over the 162 megahertz weather radio frequencies, which is where you'd expect it. The message was one of those pre-recorded sounding things that read like it was written by committee, which FEMA messages always are. It mentioned ongoing civil unrest incidents in multiple metropolitan areas and advised residents to shelter in place and limit contact with affected individuals. The specific language around affected individuals was doing a lot of work and not saying the thing it was actually referring to. I stood in front of the receiver and listened to it cycle through twice. Then I went and got my spiral notebook and wrote down the exact time and the exact language used. Then I went and did a full inventory of what I had on site. Calorie count first. I had approximately 14 months of food for one person at a normal consumption rate. More like 8 months at a somewhat generous rate that accounted for the physical work I was doing. Water. I had the deep well, which had tested clean in November, plus 400 gallons of stored water in the second-level tanks, plus filters and purification equipment. Medical supplies I've already described. Fuel. 4 55-gallon drums of diesel for the generators, properly stabilized, plus another 30 or so gallons of gasoline in jerry cans for the truck and miscellaneous use. Ammunition. This is where I was least prepared, because I'd been thinking mostly in terms of structural hardening and not in terms of active defense. I had a 308 bolt-action hunting rifle I'd owned for years, about 400 rounds for it, and a 9mm pistol with maybe 200 rounds. That was it. I made a list of what I still needed, looked at it for about 10 minutes, went to bed. The next morning I drove into town. Nearest town is Cutter, Montana. Population maybe 900, about 23 miles from the station, on a 2-lane highway that the county describes as improved gravel, even though it's mostly just ruts with aspirations. And I spent 5 hours buying things. Hardware store, feed store, the sporting goods place on Main Street, the grocery, the pharmacy. I bought extra locks, extra bolts, U-bolts, chain, baling wire, 2 more flashlights and a case of batteries. At the sporting goods store, I bought another box of 308 and as much 9mm as they had on the shelf, which was 3 boxes. I almost asked if they had more in the back, but the guy behind the counter, older guy, cowboy boots, wore a name tag that said Dale, was looking at me a little carefully, like he was doing a quiet calculation, and I didn't want to make a purchase that people would remember later. On the way out of town, I noticed that the propane place on the south end of Main Street had its door standing open, with no one visible inside, which was odd for a Tuesday morning in February. I pulled over and went in. Terry, who ran the place, was not at the counter. I called out, and he came from the back, wiping his hands on a rag, and he looked gray. Not sick gray exactly. More like a person who'd been sitting with a thought they didn't know what to do with. I asked if he was all right, and he said he was fine. His grandson had called from Portland and said something was going on out there. Had I heard about it? And I said I'd seen the emergency broadcast. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it's worth being careful." He nodded, still wiping his hands on a rag he'd already wiped clean. I asked him if he had propane tanks in stock, the 100-pound cylinders, and he said he had maybe 8 left. I bought all 8, which nearly maxed out my card, and he loaded them into my truck without asking me why I wanted 8 propane cylinders in February, which I appreciated. That was the last time I was in Cutter, the last time I was around people in town, before everything. 2 days later, the emergency broadcasts stopped being vague. I remember the exact moment because I was outside when it happened. I'd been up on the main operations building roof patching a section I was worried about, the kind of tedious work that fills a whole day and feels exactly as tedious as it sounds. And I'd left the monitoring system running downstairs with the volume turned up enough that I could hear it through the open door when I came down to get coffee. I'd just come down for the second coffee when I heard the change in tone. The broadcast I heard was not a FEMA-recorded message. It was a real voice, a woman's voice, slightly hoarse, like she'd been talking for a long time, and she was describing the situation in cities in a way that was so specific and so unlike any official broadcast I'd ever heard that I stopped moving completely, just stood there with the coffee cup in my hand. She was talking about Seattle. She was saying that a significant portion of the downtown area was inaccessible due to what she was calling mass casualty events related to rapid onset aggressive encephalitis. She was saying that hospitals in 3 states were reporting near total capacity failure. She was saying that anyone in affected areas should not seek emergency services, as emergency services could not be guaranteed to respond. She was saying to stay inside and seal your door. Then the broadcast cut to static, and then to a different frequency, a different voice. And that one was just a recorded loop saying, "Please stand by for emergency instructions," in the tone of someone who had recorded it weeks ago, without any idea what the emergency would turn out to be. I put the coffee down on the workbench and stood there. The thought that went through my head was not the thought you'd expect. It wasn't fear, exactly. It wasn't surprise. It was more like, you know when you've been waiting to hear the result of a medical test for weeks, and you already kind of know what the result is going to be, and then they call and say the thing you knew they were going to say? That. Not relief, not vindication, not anything positive. Just the weight of a thing that had been suspended becoming a thing that had landed. I went and closed the operations building's exterior door and locked the internal bolts. Then I climbed the exterior stairs to the observation post, picked up the binoculars, and stood there for a while looking at the county road in the distance. It was empty. It would stay empty for most of the next 4 days. On the 5th day, cars started coming. I need to be clear about the county road situation because it matters for everything that comes later. The gravel road that runs past the station's access gate is County Route 7, and it connects the small town of Cutter to the north, with the smaller settlement of Birch Fork to the south. Birch Fork isn't really a town, more like a cluster of ranches with a gas station and a post office that's also a bait shop. The total traffic on that road on a normal day is maybe 15 to 20 vehicles. Ranchers, a few commuters, the occasional recreational hunter or hiker. On the 5th day, I counted 87 vehicles in 6 hours. Most of them were going south. People leaving whatever was to the north, Cutter, or coming down from areas north of Cutter, or even from the highway junction 30 miles up. They were going south toward Birch Fork, or past it, toward the logging roads that led into the mountains. 2 of them stopped at my access gate. The first was a pickup truck with Wyoming plates, 2 men in the cab, who got out and stood at the gate and looked at the facility for a while. They didn't knock or shout, just looked. One of them had a shotgun in the crook of his arm, the way you carry a gun when you're not pointing it at anyone, but you want it visible. I watched them from the observation post for about 6 minutes, until they got back in the truck and drove south. The second was a minivan, older woman driving. She had what appeared to be 3 children in the back. I couldn't tell ages exactly, but they looked young, grade school range. She sat at the gate for maybe 2 minutes, engine running, looked at the facility, looked at the gate, looked back at the road, then drove on. I almost went to the gate for the minivan, got as far as putting my hand on the door of the operations building, stood there for a while, didn't go. I've thought about that a lot since. The calculation I was making in that moment, the specific shape of it. I knew that the more people I let in, the more complex my situation became. I knew I hadn't finished hardening the facility. I knew I didn't know what was on the road north of here, how close whatever was happening in Seattle or wherever had gotten, whether people who'd been in contact with whatever this was were among the people driving south. I also knew there were kids in that van. I didn't go to the gate. I'm not going to spend a lot of words justifying that decision or beating myself up over it. What I'll say is that the guilt of it sat on my chest for 3 weeks, like something heavy and physical, and I can feel it right now writing about it, and I don't think it's going to go away. What I'll also say is that if I'd opened that gate in those first days to everyone who stopped, I probably wouldn't be here now, and nobody I've found since would be here either, and the things we've figured out and the transmissions we've been tracking would have died with us. That's not a comfortable thought to lean on, but it's the one I have. The first week inside the perimeter was the strangest mixture of purposeful and horrifying. Purposeful, because I had a list, and I worked the list. Every day started the same way. Generator fuel check, battery bank charge level, perimeter walk, monitoring check, water level. I made myself do those in that order every morning before I ate or did anything else. Because routine is the thing that keeps a person from dissolving when everything around them is dissolving. The routine also kept me from spending too much time on the monitoring system. I had a laptop hooked into the monitoring setup that could pull emergency frequencies, some AM, FM for news, and what I could intercept on military government bands. The first few days there was a lot of traffic. Emergency broadcasts, some news radio that was still functioning, government coordination channels that were increasingly garbled and then went quiet. I let myself check it 3 times a day, morning, midday, evening, and I wrote down everything relevant in the notebook. The picture that assembled itself from those check-ins over the first week was not a picture that helped you sleep. Cities that had emergency services were losing them quickly. The aggressive behavior associated with the infection, I was using the word infection in my own notes even though nobody on official channels was being that blunt yet, was spreading at a rate that made normal containment models obviously insufficient. Whatever this was, it didn't work like a normal respiratory virus. The spread mechanism seemed to be physical, bite wounds, blood contact, that kind of thing. But the thing that made it different from anything historical was how quickly after infection the behavior change occurred. Hours, not days. I also started picking up on something that took me a few days to fully recognize. The helicopters had stopped. In the first 2 days, there was regular helicopter traffic overhead. Military, mostly. The sound profile was consistent with Black Hawks and the occasional heavier Chinook. They were moving north to south. And then, after about 36 hours, they started moving south to north too, which meant they were doing shuttle runs. That's a mobilization pattern. That's early-stage rapid deployment. On day 3, the helicopters stopped. Not fewer, stopped. I stood outside in the cold early morning of day 4 and listened to the sky for 20 minutes. Not a sound except wind and some crows in the spruce trees. I went back inside and sat at the workbench for a while. A military rapid deployment that goes from full-pace shuttle operations to 0 in 36 hours. That's not an organized withdrawal. That's not a planned pause. In my 11 years working military systems, I never once saw a logistics operation ramp to 0 that quickly for any good reason. I wrote "helicopter traffic ceased" in the notebook in capital letters and underlined it twice. I didn't sleep much that night. The routine of the first week settled into me in a way I hadn't expected. I kept waiting for the psychological weight of it to really land, the proper horror of what was happening out there. And instead, what I got was a kind of tunnel vision competence, task to task, problem to problem. There was always something to do, and doing things kept the specific dark thoughts from settling into permanent residence. The cold was a constant companion. February in western Montana is not subtle about cold. The operations building's heating system ran off a propane furnace that I'd serviced in January, and it worked fine. But the underground levels were naturally cold, not dangerously so, sitting around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit even in the winter. And when I was working down there, I wore 2 layers under my work vest, and my hands still got stiff within an hour. The second underground level became my primary living space within the first week. Not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, but because it was the most defensible space in the facility. And psychologically, I needed to be somewhere that felt genuinely hardened. I moved a cot down there, set up a small folding table for eating, rigged a battery-powered reading lamp off the second bank of deep-cycle batteries. I kept a kettle on a small propane burner. Hot coffee was the thing I was most obsessive about maintaining. Not for the caffeine exactly, just because the act of making coffee and the warmth of the mug in my hands was something from the before world that I could carry into this one without too much trouble. I'm in the habit of describing the second level as having a specific smell. Not bad, exactly. Well, kind of bad. Concrete and old electrical insulation, and the particular dry coolness of air that hasn't moved much in 30 years. I'd done my best to ventilate it when I was working down here, and the air handling system, once I'd gotten it running, helped. But there was a baseline note that was just that place's own atmosphere, and you stopped noticing it after about 2 days. The bunk frames I mentioned were still there from the Cold War era, 4 of them bolted to the east wall, built to hold military cots. I'd stored extra cots folded against the opposite wall, another one of those December purchases that had felt paranoid at the time. Standing in front of those folded cots in the first week, thinking about who might eventually need them, was one of those moments where the weight of everything tried to come in all at once, and I had to consciously push it back. I had a lot of those moments where I just pushed back, didn't let it settle, put it in a box in the back and kept moving. In retrospect, That was probably costing me something, psychologically speaking, but I'm only starting to understand that now. The discovery in the storage room happened on day 11. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was reorganizing the food stores, rotating stock, making sure the oldest product dates were at the front, when I found a panel in the north wall that I'd always assumed was just a section of patched concrete. It was painted the same flat gray as everything else, and I'd glanced at it a dozen times without really registering it. But that day, when I leaned over to move a case of canned tomatoes, I put my hand on the wall for balance and felt the panel shift slightly, maybe 2 millimeters. Just the tiniest give, like pushing on a door that's almost but not quite latched. I stood up and looked at it. The seam was almost perfectly invisible. Someone had done careful work to make it blend into the wall. I ran my finger along the edge and felt the concrete that wasn't concrete, some kind of painted metal, and traced it until I found the upper right corner, where there was a recessed pull point that I'd have never found if I hadn't been running my fingers along every edge. Behind the panel was a narrow alcove, maybe 3 feet deep and 5 feet wide, that had been sealed off from the main storage room at some point. Not recently. The air that came out when I opened it was noticeably older than the already old air in the room, a deeper version of that dry insulation smell, and I knew whatever was in here had been sealed in for a long time. There were 2 things in the alcove: a metal equipment case, olive drab, standard military issue type with the latches slightly corroded but functional, and a logbook, standard military composition style, green cover, rubber banded shut. I took both of them out, set them on the folding table, and stood there for a minute with my arms crossed looking at them. The metal case first, I decided. The logbook was going to require more time and attention. Inside the case, a set of sealed sample vials, the kind used for biological samples, in a foam cutout holder. 6 vials. Empty. Whatever had been in them was gone, dried out, or never put in there. But the foam cutout and the careful storage suggested someone had intended these for a specific purpose. Also in the case, a hand-drawn map of the facility's underground levels, more detailed than any official document I'd found in my research before buying the place. It showed 2 rooms I hadn't found yet, one off the south corridor of the 2nd level and one beneath the 1st level, a 3rd level I hadn't known existed. I put the map aside and picked up the logbook. The rubber band snapped apart when I touched it, dry and old. The handwriting inside was cramped and quick, like someone writing in a hurry, using their own abbreviations throughout. The dates on the entries started in August of 1987 and ran through December of the same year. I read for about an hour. I had to read some sections twice because the abbreviations and the technical shorthand were unfamiliar. But by the end, I had a reasonable picture of what I was looking at. Someone, the author never identified themselves directly, signing entries only with initials that I read as RD, had been stationed at Ridgeline in the late 1980s, doing work related to a project that wasn't named in the logbook, but was referenced consistently as the study. The study appeared to involve biological samples that had been collected from, and here the writing got more cryptic and the abbreviations were dense, a location that seemed to be overseas, possibly Southeast Asia based on context. The early entries were clinical and professional, standard logbook stuff, sample arrival dates, processing notes, temperature records. The later entries were different. By October of 1987, RD was writing things like, 3rd case this week, matching the behavioral profile, escalating agitation, loss of language function, transition to what I can only describe as predatory behavior. Subjects retain locomotion, but lose all evident higher cognition. And command continues to characterize this as an isolated biological response to a specific environmental contaminant. I do not believe this. The transmission mechanism is not environmental. I need authorization to send the secondary sample set to CDC, but authorization keeps getting denied, reclassified twice now. And in early December, near the end of the logbook, they're closing the study. All primary documentation to be transferred. I'm being reassigned. I've left the secondary samples here, level 2 alcove, north wall, because I don't trust what happens to them at a central facility, and I don't trust anyone else to understand what they are. If someone finds this, what happened here was not an accident and was not contained. The study subjects were not environmental exposure cases. They were transmission cases, human to human. Whatever RFS-19 helped identify in 1987 did not go away. I read that last part 3 times. Then I sat there for a long time with the logbook open in my lap and the empty sample vials on the table in front of me and the cold pressing down from above. RD had been writing, in 1987, about something that sounded almost exactly like what was happening right now. The behavioral profile, the transmission mechanism, the loss of cognition. Either what RD was describing in 1987 was something genuinely different that just happened to resemble what was happening now, possible, but increasingly hard to believe, or this thing, this outbreak, this infection, was not new. It had happened before. It had been studied here, in this facility, and whatever had been discovered had been buried. I put the logbook down, got up, made coffee, stood at the small propane burner watching the water boil and thinking about all the ways this could be a coincidence. I couldn't think of enough of them to feel better. That night I reread the entry about the 3rd sublevel. In the morning, I found it. The 3rd level existed, though level is generous. It was more like a room that had been dug below the 2nd level, accessible through a hatch in the floor of the south corridor that was itself hidden under a section of removable metal flooring that I'd assumed was a service panel. 12 concrete steps led down into a space that was roughly 20 by 15 feet, with a ceiling low enough that I had to bend slightly at the head. It was empty, mostly. Empty in the way that a space gets when everything in it has been removed carefully and intentionally, with cleaning done afterward. But there were details that told you things had been there. 4 dark squares on the floor where heavy equipment had sat. The concrete protected from whatever process had stained the surrounding area. The stain itself was old and uniform enough that it was hard to say what had caused it. Could have been a coolant leak, could have been cleaning chemicals, could have been something I didn't want to think about. There was also, on the south wall, a series of mounting brackets and a bank of outlets that were still live when I tested them, which meant this sublevel had been on the facility's power grid, even though it didn't appear on any official plans I'd found. Someone had wired it off book, connected it to the main power routing on the 1st level but not documented it. And on the ceiling, directly above where the largest floor stain was, a ventilation port that had been sealed with concrete, recently sealed, compared to everything else, not 1993 sealed, more like early 2000s sealed. Someone had come back to this facility after decommissioning and sealed that vent from the inside. I thought about that for a long time. Then I went upstairs and did my perimeter check, because it was that time, and the routine was the routine. The thing at the tree line was there, same spot, standing still, facing the facility. I watched it for a while. It wasn't doing anything. It didn't move the whole time I watched. Just stood there, at 300 yards in the morning light, slightly hunched at the shoulders, with its arms loose at its sides. I went inside and made breakfast. Day 17. I need to talk about the first supply run, because I've been putting it off in this account, and I should just say it directly. I was scared. Not the kind of scared that's a passing feeling, but the kind that's physical. The way it changed how I breathed and made my hands unnecessarily careful with things. Like if I was too hasty holding the steering wheel, something bad would happen. I'd done the math on my supplies, and even with disciplined rationing, I was going to run into deficits in certain categories by week 8 or 9. Not food. I had food covered. Medical supplies were okay. The problem was diesel fuel. I had 4 55-gallon drums when things locked down, and the generators burned more than I'd planned because the cold February nights were colder than my fuel calculations had assumed. I was also burning fuel doing longer heating cycles in the 2nd level to keep conditions acceptable down there, which I hadn't fully accounted for. I needed fuel. The nearest likely source was Qatar, 23 miles north. I spent 2 days preparing for the run, went through every piece of gear, checked tire pressure on the truck, mapped out the route, and noted 3 alternate routes in case the primary was blocked. Packed a go bag with enough supplies for 3 days in case I got stranded. Assembled a communication kit, the handheld scanner, a secondary receiver, a basic radio I could broadcast on if needed. I also made a decision that I'd been thinking about for a few days. I was going to leave all the external lights running while I was gone. The perimeter lights, and the light I'd rigged on the observation post. My reasoning was that a well-lit facility looked occupied and potentially defended, which might deter casual opportunists from getting too close and discovering my access situation. Leaving it dark while I was gone might make it look abandoned and therefore interesting to people with bad intentions. The thing I was less certain about was whether the lights might attract infected. Based on what I'd observed from the observation post, including the one at the tree line, they didn't seem strongly driven by visual stimuli. Sound was the obvious attractor. Movement, maybe. But they didn't seem to track light sources the way a human would, so I left the lights on. I went out the gate at 4:15 in the morning. I'd wanted to be in Qatar and back before full daylight if possible. The drive north on Route 7 was the longest 23 miles I've ever driven. The road was empty the whole way, but it wasn't empty the way roads are empty at 4 in the morning normally, where you get that peaceful 3 a.m. feeling of having the world to yourself. This was empty the way a room is empty after everyone has left unexpectedly. There was debris on the road in 2 places, items that had fallen from vehicle roofs or beds, a sleeping bag in one spot, a plastic storage container split open and spilling what looked like clothes. I drove around both without stopping. About 12 miles out from Qatar, I passed a car that had gone off the road into the drainage ditch on the west side. Older sedan, driver's door standing open. I didn't stop to look closer. My headlights showed me enough as I drove by to see that the car was empty, which was both a relief and, in a different way, not. Qatar in the near dark was quiet. More quiet than a town of 900 people should be even at 4 in the morning, because even at 4 in the morning there are ambient sounds. A truck idling somewhere, a light in a window, a dog. What I heard when I slowed the truck to a rolling pace at the south end of Main Street was nothing. What I saw was 3 separate storefronts with their windows broken, including the hardware store, which put a specific kind of tension in my chest, because the hardware store was one of my planned stops. I sat in the truck at the south end of Main Street for about 3 minutes, with the engine idling and the headlights on, watching for movement. I saw one. It was on the east side of the street, coming out of the gap between 2 buildings, moving toward the street, at a pace that I can only describe as purposeful, without being fast. The headlights caught it, and it kept coming. Didn't change its behavior at all when the lights hit it. I'd seen footage of infected people on the monitoring broadcasts. Seeing one in person in the headlights of my truck, 40 yards away, was something entirely different. The way it moved was wrong in a way that's hard to describe. Not dramatically different enough to be obviously monstrous from a distance, but wrong enough that every one of the animal parts of your brain lights up at once. Too loose in the joints. Head angle wrong. That loose arm swing I'd been observing through binoculars from 300 yards, now close enough to see clearly. I drove past it, didn't stop, drove the 2 blocks to the propane station, which was dark but appeared intact. Drove another block to the auto parts store, which was one of my primary targets for diesel storage containers and fuel additives. The auto parts store's front window was broken but not fully cleared. Someone had reached through to grab things off the front shelf, probably, but hadn't gotten in. I parked the truck with the bed facing the store's side entrance, which was intact, got out with my tire iron and the 9mm on my hip, and worked the side door. I was inside for maybe 25 minutes. I moved fast, and I tried not to make noise, and I failed at not making noise about 4 times. A display rack that fell over when I brushed it, a sliding door on a cabinet that screeched, something that fell off a high shelf in the back when I bumped the rack below it. Each noise made me stop and wait and listen. Each time after the noise, the store settled back into quiet, and I kept moving. I came out with 4 5-gallon fuel jugs, a large selection of fuel additives and stabilizers, a hydraulic jack that was better than what I had, and a collection of miscellaneous hardware that had caught my eye. I'd also found, on a shelf in the back near the service counter, a case of emergency road flares and 3 large boxes of road emergency reflectors. Useful. I took all of it. The propane station was my next stop, Terry's place. The door was locked, but the padlock was on a hasp that gave up quickly with the tire iron. Inside, 1,200-pound cylinders still on the racks along the back wall, full. I took 6 of them and couldn't fit more in the truck. I also took a bag of parts from behind the service counter that appeared to be regulator fittings and hose connections. While I was loading the propane cylinders, I heard something from the street. Not close. 2 blocks north, maybe 3. A sound that wasn't quite a shout and wasn't quite a scream. Something in between, sharp and then cut off. Then something that sounded like impact. Then nothing. I finished loading, got in the truck, drove south out of town without stopping anywhere else. I didn't stop for the hardware store. I thought about stopping. I had a list of things from the hardware store. But the sound I'd heard from the north end of town stayed with me for the whole drive, and the decision was made somewhere below the conscious level. South. Now. Fast. Back on Route 7 heading south, I had about 15 miles of clear road before I hit the turnoff to the facility access track, and somewhere in the middle of those 15 miles the shaking started. Just my hands at first. The wheel was vibrating slightly anyway on the gravel, and I could feel my hands trembling against it. A distinct thing separate from the road vibration. Then my shoulders. Not dramatic, not sobbing or falling apart. Just the body finally doing what it had been holding off on doing while I was inside the auto parts store trying not to drop things. I let it happen. Kept driving. By the time I turned onto the access track it was mostly done, and by the time I got the gate closed behind me and drove up to the operations building I felt something closer to normal. I sat in the truck for a few minutes with the engine off. The lights on the perimeter fence were still on. The observation post light was still on. The facility looked exactly as I'd left it. I got out and started unloading. 3 days after the supply run, I found the helicopter. I'd been expanding my perimeter walks, going beyond the fence, out into the surrounding terrain, in the early morning before full light, which was when any infected in the area seemed to be least active. I don't know if least active is even accurate. It's more that the ones I'd observed seemed to respond to sound and movement rather than time of day. And at 5 a.m. in the Montana backcountry, there's so little sound or movement that they didn't seem to be doing much of anything. I'd been making these walks for 5 or 6 days, carrying the rifle and working in a rough, expanding circle around the facility, getting a better sense of the terrain, looking for access routes I hadn't mapped, checking for anything I'd missed in my initial assessment. On this particular morning, I went about a half-mile farther northeast than I'd been before, working up through the spruce trees toward the ridge, and I found the helicopter in a clearing about half a mile past the tree line. It had come down hard. Not a full, uncontrolled crash. There was no large debris field, no explosion damage. But it had come down faster than it should have, and hit ground at an angle. One of the landing struts had collapsed, and the main body of the aircraft was tilted at maybe 30 degrees. The rotor blades were bent, and one had sheared off entirely, and was lying about 40 feet away in the snow. It was a Black Hawk. Army markings. The side door was hanging open at an angle because of the tilt. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time before I went in, looking for movement around the aircraft, checking the tree line in all directions. Nothing. The cockpit was empty. The cargo area was empty. No bodies, no gear, nothing in the seats or on the floor except a scattering of items that had been on the seats and gotten thrown around in the impact. A ballistic vest, a first aid pouch, a headset, 2 MRE wrappers, and a plastic-sheathed document folder that had slid under the forward bulkhead and would have been invisible to someone looking quickly. I took everything. The ballistic vest was intact, and my size was close enough. The first aid pouch had supplies I didn't have. The headset was military spec and compatible with frequency ranges I could use. The document folder took me the rest of the morning to fully absorb. It was a command briefing packet dated 11 days ago, meaning it had been prepared well before today, probably on the first or second day of whatever the formal response had been. Military briefing documents have a specific format that I recognized from my Air Force years, and the first thing I noticed was the classification marking at the top, which was 2 levels above anything I'd been cleared for in my career. The second thing I noticed was that someone had hand-stamped the front page with a red stamp that said, "Pending authentication," which meant this was a working draft that hadn't been fully processed before someone took it into the field. The contents were dry, in that specific military brief way that strips emotional content out of enormous things. What I read: the infection had originated, or rather, the first confirmed human cases in the current outbreak had originated, not from wildlife or environmental exposure, but from 3 simultaneous events in cities 3,000 miles apart. Events that happened within 8 hours of each other. The briefing document did not comment on the improbability of this. It just listed it. The initial spread rate had exceeded every model the CDC and DoD had run for even worst-case pathogen scenarios. The reason was the transmission mechanism. The neurological infection altered behavior so rapidly, and the bite transmission route was so efficient in close quarters that standard containment protocols, designed for respiratory or contact-spread pathogens, were essentially irrelevant from the beginning. The Army had mobilized roughly 18 hours after the first confirmed cases. The briefing document described the mobilization effort in present tense, meaning it had been written while the effort was still ongoing. But embedded in the operational updates was a line that hit me hard. As of, aviation assets in theater have been withdrawn from active operations due to, and current flight clearance is restricted to emergency medical evacuation only. Aviation assets withdrawn. That explained the helicopter traffic dying. But it didn't explain why this Black Hawk was here, crashed in a clearing a half-mile from my facility, with no crew and no obvious explanation. I searched the cockpit again, more carefully this time. On the pilot's side, wedged between the seat and the console, in a way that suggested it had been deliberately put there, rather than fallen there, a handheld radio. Small unit, military spec, with a long-life battery pack. I turned it on. It was broadcasting on a frequency I recognized from my monitoring work. A frequency I'd been hearing traffic on for the past week, traffic that I'd been recording and trying to make sense of. The traffic that kept cycling through what I'd been half convinced was a coded pattern. I stood in the tilted cockpit with this radio in my hand, listening to it cycle through the signal again, and I felt something I hadn't felt since all of this started. Not hope exactly, more like the sense that there was more to figure out than I'd thought, and that figuring it out mattered. I put the radio in my pack and walked back to the facility. On day 24, Donna arrived. I heard her truck before I saw it. One of the things about living up in the observation post at irregular intervals is that you develop an ear for engine sounds, the way you develop an ear for anything you attend to consistently. The truck was coming from the south, from the Birch Fork direction, moving slow and stopping twice on the access track before the gate. That told me something. Someone moving slow and stopping was either being cautious about the terrain or cautious about being seen, and either way, it wasn't a panicked person running from something. Panicked people drive fast and don't stop. I was on the observation post with the binoculars when the truck came into view at the gate. Late model F-250, rust on the rear wheel wells, a livestock rack on the bed that currently held what looked like supply boxes rather than animals. Single occupant visible through the windshield. A woman, middle age, wearing a brown canvas jacket. She sat at the gate for about 2 minutes. Then she got out of the truck and walked to the gate and looked at the facility without touching anything. Stood there. Then she went back to the truck and sat. I watched her for about 10 more minutes. Then I went downstairs and out to the gate. She got out of the truck again when she saw me coming and stood next to the driver's door with her hands visible, which I took as deliberate and appreciated. She was maybe late 40s, solid build, the kind of face that looked like it had spent time outdoors over a long period of time. Short hair, going gray at the temples, a scratch on her left cheek that was maybe a week old. She said, "You've been watching me from up there since I came up the road." Not a question. I said yes. She nodded. "I drove past your fence 3 days ago and turned around. The lights were on and I couldn't see anyone, and I wasn't sure if that meant someone was here or someone had left in a hurry." I said, "I was here." She nodded again. "I'm a large animal vet," she said. "My clinic was, about 30 miles south, just off the Birch Fork Road. I've been there for the last 3 weeks." She paused. "My tech. She left on day 4. took her car, and went north to try to get to her family. I haven't heard from her since. She said it in the tone of someone reporting a fact that they have made peace with, and then said, "I have equipment, medications, including some human-relevant antibiotics and surgical supplies, and about 400 pounds of high-calorie dry goods from the clinic's pet food stock." The last part sounds strange, but it's caloric, and it keeps. I said it doesn't sound strange. I also, she said, have a 16-year-old boy in the back of the truck. I looked. The livestock rack. The supply boxes had a gap between them I hadn't noticed from the observation post, and in the gap, sitting on what appeared to be a folded sleeping bag, was a kid, looking at me without much expression, wearing 2 large clothes and a beanie pulled down to his eyebrows. She said, "Found him about a week ago on the Birch Fork Road, walking. He says his name is Pete." She lowered her voice slightly, which struck me as a bit performative, given that Pete was clearly in earshot, but I understood the impulse. He hasn't told me much about where he came from or how he got there, but he's useful, and he doesn't complain. I looked at Pete. Pete looked at me. "Where were you going?" I said to him. He thought about it. "Somewhere with a fence," he said. I opened the gate. Donna's name was Donna Pruitt. Pete, it turned out, was Pete Calloway, and the story of how he'd ended up walking alone on the Birch Fork Road came out in pieces over the first week. Not all at once, and not because he was trying to hide anything specifically, more because he was 17 and uncomfortable with emotional recounting, which is a completely understandable condition. His family had been driving south from Great Falls when their car had broken down, overheating, because his father had been pushing the engine hard on a hot day on rough roads. They'd been on the road on foot for several hours when they were caught by a group of 3 infected in an open stretch of road. Pete had run. He was specific about that in a way that told me it cost him something to say it. He'd run, and his parents hadn't. He'd been walking for days when Donna found him. I didn't push him on any of it. Donna didn't either, and I noticed that. She had a way of making space for people without filling it. She and Pete set up in the second level that first night. She did it efficiently, without asking many questions about the layout or the setup. Just moved through the space assessing it, asking clarifying questions when she needed to, adjusting the bunk assignments in a way that put Pete's bunk closest to the stairwell, for reasons she didn't explain, but didn't need to. I made coffee, and we sat at the folding table in the second level, and I told her the general shape of what I knew about the situation. She listened to all of it. When I got to the logbook and what I'd found in the alcove, her expression changed in a way that was controlled, but not quite controlled enough. A tightening around the eyes, a brief pause before she responded. She said, "I treated a dog last February. Border Collie, female, about 4 years old. Owner was a researcher at U of M. I want to say environmental sciences, something like that. The dog had bite wounds consistent with a wild animal attack and showed neurological symptoms I'd never seen. Rapid behavioral change, loss of conditioning responses, then complete loss of whatever you'd call normal dogness. Just drive. Pure drive." She stopped. It spread to 2 other animals in my clinic before I figured out what was happening. I put all 3 down. She put her coffee cup on the table and looked at it. "I sent a report to the State Veterinary Board in March," she said. "I didn't hear back." Nobody said anything for a while. Pete had been quiet through all of it, sitting on his bunk with his knees pulled up. He said, without looking up, "There was a thing on Reddit in January. Videos. They got taken down really fast." "I saw something like that," I said. He nodded. That was the end of that conversation for the night. Over the next several days, Donna and I worked out a routine that incorporated her skills in a way that made both of us more capable. She took over the medical inventory entirely, reorganized everything, labeled it clearly, put together a proper triage kit that she kept in a specific bag near the stairwell, the reasoning being that if we needed it quickly, we needed to know exactly where it was without thinking. She also proved unexpectedly useful with the monitoring equipment. She wasn't technically trained in radio, but she had a very good ear for patterns, and she started spending a couple hours a day at the monitoring bench, which freed me up for physical maintenance work that needed doing. Pete was quiet, but capable. He had good hands, fine motor control, patient and careful, and I put him to work on a project I'd been putting off, reinforcing the main gate's locking mechanism with a secondary bar system that would make it much harder to force from the outside. He worked at it for 2 days without complaining, and the result was better than I could have done faster, because he was methodical in a way that cost nothing to let run its course. He also found things. It was a habit he had, moving through the facility slowly, noticing things, picking up small items and turning them in his hands. He found a second ventilation exit from the second level that I hadn't known about, concealed behind a false panel in the east corridor. He found a cache of old military field rations in a wall locker in Building C that I'd missed in my initial survey. 24 MREs that were old, but technically not expired for several more years. He found, on a shelf in the equipment barn, a hand-drawn diagram of the facility's external antenna array that was more detailed and more accurate than the official plans I'd been working from. He didn't say much when he found these things. He just brought them to me, or left them on the workbench with a note. I found myself being grateful for him in a way that wasn't complicated by any of the things that make gratitude complicated. The strange thing at the tree line continued. Day 28, day 29, day 30. Donna had seen it on day 26, the second full morning she was here. She'd been on the observation post early, and she came down and found me at breakfast and described it. And I said, I know. I've been watching it for weeks. She said, what do you think it's responding to? I said, probably audio or vibrational stimulus from the equipment. She said she thought so too. We ate breakfast. But on day 32, something changed. I was on the observation post at mid-morning, standard check, and the thing was at the tree line in its usual spot, doing its usual nothing. I watched it for a while through the binoculars and started to put them down, and then something made me look again. It had moved, maybe 10 yards closer to the fence line, still facing the facility, still standing mostly still, but closer than the spot it had been occupying for 11 days. I watched it for the next 2 hours. It moved 3 more times, small increments, always toward the fence, always slow enough that you'd miss it if you weren't watching specifically for it. By noon, it was maybe 250 yards from the outer fence, instead of 300. I called Donna up to see it. She watched for a while and then she said, "Generator's running today." I thought about that. The generator had been running today because I'd been doing a full charge cycle on the deep cycle battery banks, which required the generator at higher load than usual. The load on the generator made it run slightly louder than normal, which on a still day like today meant the sound traveled farther and more distinctly through the terrain. "It's following the sound gradient," I said. She said yes. After that, I was much more careful about when I ran the generator at high load. Early mornings when I ran it at low maintenance load seemed to be fine. The sound wasn't distinguishable at 300 yards. But full load cycles, or running multiple building systems simultaneously, created a profile that things outside the fence were apparently capable of following toward its source. This was one of those things that sounds obvious in retrospect and feels like a genuine revelation when you figure it out. I also started varying the generator schedule, not randomly. Randomly is harder to maintain than a pattern, but on a rotating 12-day cycle, running it on different hours each day, in a way that would make it harder for anything tracking sound to establish a predictable schedule. The thing at the tree line went back to the usual spot the following morning. I don't know if that means the strategy worked, or just that the higher load sound was gone and it lost interest, but it didn't come closer again after that. Walt arrived 6 weeks and 2 days after I locked the gate. I almost didn't let him in. The circumstances of his arrival were unusual enough that caution was appropriate. He came at night, specifically around 11 p.m., which was outside the hours I'd been monitoring the gate approach closely, because the practical need for anyone to be driving on that road at 11 p.m. without specific knowledge of the facility's existence was low. I heard the truck on the access track, and I was upstairs immediately with the rifle and the binoculars, watching. He drove to within about 40 yards of the outer fence, stopped, and turned the headlights off. In the dark, I could barely make out the shape of the vehicle. Older pickup, I could tell that much. And one person in the cab. I stayed on the observation post for 5 more minutes. The truck didn't move. Nobody got out. The hazards stayed off after the initial signal. I went down, grabbed the 9mm, and walked to the gate. He got out of the truck when he saw me coming. Old guy, mid-60s at a minimum, the kind of thin that suggests a person has always been thin rather than lost weight, wearing a baseball cap with a ham radio club logo on it, and a jacket with too many pockets. He stood at the truck's hood with his hands visible and waited for me to reach the gate. "I've been monitoring the facility for 11 days, he said, before I said anything. His voice was gravelly, like a man who'd been talking to himself a lot recently. Not the facility specifically, the signal that's coming from your direction, or close to your direction. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly and produced a folded paper. "That's a frequency log. The transmission started 6 weeks ago, roughly. It's on a pattern. If you haven't been listening for it, you've probably missed it." I looked at the frequency log through the fence without taking it. The frequencies written down were ones I recognized from the signal I'd been picking up on the military radio from the helicopter. "I know the transmission," I said. He looked at me steadily. "Have you decoded it?" I hadn't, not fully. I'd been working on it, but the pattern wasn't yielding to my analysis methods, which were more engineering than cryptography. "Have you?" I said. He said, "I've been a licensed amateur radio operator for 40 years. I've been doing coded transmission work as a hobby for most of that." He paused. "Partially decoded. The full decode needs more raw intercepts than I have." I stood at the gate looking at him. "What's your name?" I said. "Walt Haggerty," he said. "I lived near Birch Fork. I've been in my truck for 6 days. I'm out of food." I opened the gate. Walt Haggerty was a retired electrical contractor from Helena who had moved to a small property near Birch Fork 10 years ago, for reasons he described as quiet, mostly. He had an amateur radio setup in his workshop that he described with the understated pride of someone who has spent 20 years building something specific and excellent and knows it without needing anyone else to confirm it. He also, as became clear over the first few days, had an encyclopedic knowledge of historical military communication protocols that came from a combination of amateur radio work, a specific interest in Cold War signals intelligence history, and, he said this casually, the way you mention something that you assume most people already know, a short stint in Army Signal Corps in the mid-1970s. 46 years ago, he said, when Donna raised an eyebrow at the Signal Corps mention. Different world, different army, different me. He and Pete took to each other almost immediately, which I hadn't anticipated, but was glad for. Walt had the natural teaching register of someone who'd been explaining technical things to people for decades without the self-importance that sometimes comes with it. He could make something complex simple without condescending. Pete listened to him the way Pete didn't listen to much else. Walt spent most of his first 2 days at the monitoring bench. Donna had organized it well enough that he could work without needing to ask where things were, and he settled into it with the focused ease of someone doing something they know. He had brought his own receiver in the truck, a high-quality wideband unit that outperformed what I had, and integrating it with my existing setup gave us coverage we hadn't had before. On the 3rd evening after his arrival, he came to find me in the equipment barn, where I was doing maintenance on the secondary generator. He stood in the doorway and said, "I've gotten further with the transmission." I put down the wrench. "How far?" "Far enough to tell you it's not military." He paused. "Or not current military anyway. The protocol is older, pre-digital era. Specifically, it's a variant of a ComSec protocol that was in use in the mid to late 1980s by certain, I want to be precise here, certain programs that operated outside normal military chain of command." I looked at him. "The 1987 logbook," I said. He nodded slowly. "Show me." I showed him the logbook the next morning. He read it twice, all the way through, without saying anything. Then he put it down and looked at the equipment case with the empty sample vials and the hand-drawn facility map. He picked up the map and studied it. "The 3rd level," he said. "You can see it? I can infer it from the power routing." He tapped the map. "This bus line here has more capacity than anything on this level needs. It's routing to something below." "I found it. It's empty now." He nodded. Then he said something that recalibrated everything I'd been thinking about this situation. "The transmission source," he said, "is not far. Not like, it's not coming from a bunker in Nevada or an army base in Colorado. Based on the signal strength pattern and the directionality I've been working with, the source is within 20 miles of this facility. Probably within 15. I stared at him. "There is nothing within 15 miles of this facility," I said. "I know this terrain. I've been reading topographic maps of this area for 4 years." Walt looked at me with the patience of someone who knows they're about to show you something that changes your understanding. "There's a natural cave system," he said, "about 11 miles northeast. The topographic maps you have don't show it because it was surveyed and then classified in 1988. It's in the Forest Service records under a different designation." "Classified by who?" He picked up the logbook again, looked at the initials RD on the last entry. "I'm guessing whoever closed this place down," he said. "Yvonne came on day 45, and I didn't like her from the start, which bothered me, because I didn't know if that was instinct or just the toll of the past 6 weeks making me suspicious of everyone. She arrived at the gate in mid-afternoon, walking, no vehicle. She was carrying a military-style pack that was too new, and she was wearing clothes that were too clean. Not impossibly clean, but cleaner than someone who'd been walking in the Montana backcountry on foot for any amount of time should realistically be. She said her name was Yvonne Crawford. She said she was a trauma nurse from a hospital in Missoula who had evacuated when the hospital was overrun. She said she'd been on foot for 2 weeks, moving south and west through the backcountry, and had spotted the facility's lights from a high point on the ridge to the northeast. Northeast. That was the direction the transmission was coming from. I didn't say that. I let her talk. She was in her mid-30s, brown hair pulled back, the kind of calm that reads as professional composure on a person who works in emergency medicine. She answered every question I asked her directly and without hesitation. Trauma nurse, St. Joseph's, Missoula. Been at the hospital 9 years. Evacuated with 3 colleagues. Got separated during the first night on foot in difficult terrain. I let her in. I told myself it was because Donna's medical assessment of her was that she appeared healthy and showed no signs of infection. Donna did this check quietly, the standard visual assessment we'd agreed on, and because a trauma nurse's skills were genuinely valuable to us. Both things were true. But I also watched her. The thing I noticed in the first 3 days was how little she asked. New people, when they arrive somewhere, ask questions. They need to orient themselves. They want to understand the routines, the rules, the layout. Donna had asked specific and useful questions in her first days. Walt had done the same. Even Pete, who was mostly quiet, had spent his first week mapping the facility in his own head, visibly looking at things, working out how they connected. Yvonne oriented quickly and then stopped asking. Not in a way that suggested she already knew, more in a way that suggested she didn't need to. I mentioned this to Walt one evening when we were working late at the monitoring bench. I said something like, "A nurse from a Missoula hospital evacuating on foot for 2 weeks, through winter backcountry, and ending up within visual range of a remote facility she had no way to know about. What did he think of that?" He thought about it for a while. Then he said, "The ridge she mentioned, the high point to the northeast." "Yeah, I've been up there," he said. "You can see the facility from there. But to get a useful sighting, to know this was a working facility and not just an abandoned one, you'd need to have been there at the right time." "The generator cycle," I said. "Or the perimeter lights," he said. "Someone on that ridge at the right time would have seen both, would have known this was occupied. The ridge was also in the direction of the cave system." I didn't confront Yvonne. Not yet. I kept watching. What I found in her pack on day 51 I found by accident, mostly. She'd left her pack in the equipment barn. She'd been helping Pete with some physical work out there and had apparently come back for dinner without it. I went to the barn that evening for a spare fuse from the bins along the back wall, and her pack was sitting open on the workbench with the contents partly spilled. She'd been in a hurry to get something out of it and hadn't closed it back up. I wasn't looking in her pack. I was looking for the fuse, but the pack was right there, and the flap was open, and what I saw, without trying to see it, was a radio unit tucked inside, underneath a layer of clothing. That was not a personal emergency radio. It was a compact two-way unit, with a throat mic lead coiled around it. Military grade. Current generation, not the vintage stuff I'd been working with. I stared at it for about 5 seconds. Then I took a fuse and went back to what I was doing. I found Walt before dinner and told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Last night I picked up a transmission that broke the pattern. The usual signal is on a 6-hour cycle. This one was shorter and on a different frequency. I couldn't decode it." When last night, he thought. About 9:45. Yvonne had excused herself at around 9:15, saying she was tired. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my cot in the second level and thought through every interaction with her, looking for what I'd missed. The answer, when I assembled it, was less dramatic than I'd feared, and more troubling in a different way. I didn't think she was a threat in the immediate sense. I didn't think she was infected, or malicious, or planning something against us specifically. What I thought, and this was a guess built on limited information, but it felt right in the way that inferences from patterns feel right when the patterns are solid, was that she was connected to whoever was at the other end of the transmission, the cave system. The question was what that meant. Were the people at the cave system a threat to us? Did they want the facility? Did they have some other purpose? I thought about the 1987 logbook, RD warning, that what had been studied here was not contained, the sealed vent in the 3rd sublevel, the hidden alcove with the empty sample vials. Someone had known about this facility, and what it had been used for, had known before I bought it, maybe had been monitoring it. In the morning, I asked Donna to meet me in the 2nd level, before Yvonne was awake. I told her what I'd found. She listened, and when I finished, she said, "So what do we do?" I said, "I think we need to figure out what's in that cave before they come to us." She nodded. Then she said, "She's going to know we know if we act differently." I know. So either we act the same and plan around her, or we confront her directly and hope she tells us the truth. I thought about it. What would you do? She picked up her coffee cup. I'd talk to her. Directly. Because I'm bad at pretending I don't know things I know. I went and got Yvonne. The conversation that morning in the equipment barn was the most uncomfortable 40 minutes of the past 2 months. I say that as a specific comparison, not a general one. I've had moments that were more terrifying, but this was uncomfortable in the specific way of things that are uncertain and interpersonal and can't be solved with physical work. I told her what I'd seen in her pack. I didn't apologize for having seen it. I said I'd seen a radio unit and I wanted to understand what it was. She looked at me for a long time. "It's not what you're worried about," she said. "What am I worried about?" "That someone sent me to scout you. That there are people coming." She paused. "That you're in danger." "Are there? Am I?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't lying about being a nurse, or about Missoula, any of that." She exhaled slowly. "The people in the cave system, I know them. I've known about the cave since before the outbreak. There's a woman who runs the group there. Her name is Kessler. She's been living in that cave system with a group since November last year. She knew this was coming, more specifically than most people. She sent me to find out about this facility because she knew what it was used for, and she wanted to know if anyone was here and what state the equipment was in. Knew what it was used for how?" I said. Yvonne hesitated. "The logbook," she said. "The 1987 study, RD." I felt the hair on my arms react. "You know who RD is?" "Kessler does," she said. "RD is Kessler's grandmother." I needed a day to process that. Literally. I needed a full day of physical work to let it settle into something I could think about clearly. So I spent the day doing maintenance I'd been putting off, checking the second generator's fuel injectors, recalibrating the battery bank monitoring system, resealing a section of the second-level floor drain that had been weeping slightly. Physical problems with physical solutions. My hands knew what they were doing, and the rest of my brain could work in the background. What I came back to, by late afternoon, RD's granddaughter was 11 miles away in a cave with, Yvonne had said 40+ people, though she'd been vague about the exact number. A granddaughter who had, by Yvonne's account, grown up with specific knowledge of what her grandmother had studied at this facility in 1987, who had begun preparing a living space in the cave system at least 4 months before the outbreak officially began, who had known this was coming. The question that pressed on me hardest was not whether to trust them. I was past the point where trust was a binary thing. The question was what their 40+ people in a cave system needed, what we, in a hardened surface facility, could potentially offer, and what a combination of those two groups might be capable of that neither could do alone. I went and found Walt. He was at the monitoring bench. When I came in, he turned and held up a finger, wait, and adjusted something on the receiver, and listened for a moment, then wrote something in his decode notebook. Something new? I said. She's transmitting again, he said. More of the signal. Enough to finish the decode. He wrote for another 30 seconds, then put the pen down and handed me the notebook. I read what he'd written. The decoded transmission, in full, was Ridgeline Station. This is Birch Cave Relay. We have 47 survivors, including 3 medical. Current supply status critical. Water contamination from runoff. Beginning week 7. Request immediate contact and supply assessment. We know what this is and where it started. We have RD archives. Suggest joint survival strategy. We will not approach without contact. Reply on this frequency. I read it twice. Water contamination, I said. Walt nodded. Week 7. We're in week 7. 47 people. With a water problem. Donna put together an assessment of what we could offer without compromising our own operational status. She did it in about 3 hours, which told me she'd been thinking about this contingency even without knowing the specific shape it would take. The math she worked out. Our water supply from the deep well was not under the same strain as a natural cave system. The well was lined, sealed at the surface, drawing from a deep aquifer that the surrounding terrain didn't drain into directly. If the runoff contamination Birch Cave was experiencing was surface level, which it likely was, given the season and the snowmelt cycle starting, our water was safe where theirs wasn't. We had filtration equipment that could help them even if they couldn't get to us. We had medical supplies that would complement their 3-person medical team. We had, in the radar station's long-range observation setup, a surveillance capability that no cave system had. We could see what was moving across the landscape in a way that would dramatically improve the safety of any movement they needed to do. And they had RD's archives. Whatever that meant precisely, it likely meant a documented understanding of the biological mechanism behind the infection that was decades ahead of anything we'd been working with, from news reports and a single handwritten field logbook. She handed me the assessment and said, "This is a yes." I said, "I know." We talked about the logistics for 3 days, how to make contact, using Walt's setup to reply on the transmission frequency, what terms to propose, how to handle the first face-to-face meeting in a way that maintained security for both groups, what the supply transfer would look like. Yvonne, once it was clear that we were proceeding, became more useful than she'd been in her first 2 weeks. She knew the cave system's layout, the approach routes, the people there. She could tell us who was in the group and what skills existed. She gave us this information without being asked to, I think because she was relieved to be done with the in-between situation she'd been in and ready to be straightforwardly useful. On day 58, we made contact. Walt transmitted a reply on the frequency. It was short, because short transmissions are harder to locate than long ones, and because what needed saying could be said briefly. Birch Cave Relay. This is Ridgeline. Transmission received and decoded. Contact accepted. Propose initial meeting at halfway point on Northeast Ridge. Single representative each party. Daytime, current weather. Reply to confirm. The reply came within 2 hours. Ridgeline. Confirmed. Tomorrow, 1,000 hours. Representative Wilby Kessler. The night before I went to the ridge, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared of the meeting specifically, but because the weight of everything that had accumulated over the past 60-odd days had found a moment to actually land. When you're in the daily operational grind of survival, the bigger picture stays compressed. You deal with what's in front of you. But that night, lying on the cot in the second level, with Walt snoring quietly in the bunk across from me, and the air handling system putting out its low, steady breath, the bigger picture expanded, and I had to let it. What I was going to walk into was a conversation with the granddaughter of the person who had studied this thing in 1987 and known it wasn't contained, and tried to tell someone and been ignored. What that meant, in practical terms, was that the outbreak wasn't a surprise to everyone. Some people had known it was possible. Some people had known it was coming. I'd been one of those people, in a limited and unspecific way. Kessler had been more specific. RD had been the most specific of all, writing it out in careful field note language in 1987 and hiding the documentation in a wall because she didn't trust it in official hands. The question I kept coming back to wasn't what the outbreak was, or how it had started, or whether it could be stopped. Those were questions for later, maybe for people with more resources than we had. The question I kept coming back to was, what do you do with the knowledge that something could have been prevented and wasn't? I didn't have a satisfying answer. I still don't. I lay there and listened to the air handling system, and eventually I slept. The morning of day 59. I dressed for weather and functionality, not for meeting someone, which meant layers I could move in, the holstered 9mm, the radio set to the agreed frequency. I took a day pack with emergency supplies, the military binoculars, and a copy of the RD logbook pages I'd photographed on my phone before the grid went down. Donna walked with me to the gate. She didn't say much. At the gate, she handed me a small first aid kit, one of the redundant ones from her medical stores, and said, "For them, show good faith with something concrete." I took it. "If I'm not back by 1700. She said, "I know. Walt knows the protocol. Garrett." She looked at me directly. "Come back." I walked out the gate and into the morning. The 11 miles to the ridge took me about 4 hours, moving carefully and watching the terrain. I saw infected in 2 places. Once, a single figure in a clearing about 400 yards east, doing the same aimless standing thing they all seemed to do when they had no specific sound to move toward. And once, 3 of them along a stream bed that I gave wide enough berth to avoid triggering anything. The terrain was rough enough that the wide berth cost me time, but it was worth the time. The halfway point on the northeast ridge was a rocky outcropping that commanded views in 3 directions, which was clearly why it had been chosen for the meeting. I got there at 9:50 and sat on a rock that had been warmed by the morning sun, and drank some water and waited. At 10:07, Kessler arrived from the north slope. She was maybe 55, compact and deliberate in how she moved, the specific physicality of someone who has spent a lot of time in difficult terrain. Dark jacket, dark pants, nothing that caught light, graying hair cut short. She was carrying a rifle slung across her back and a bag that looked like it might have documentation in it. She stopped at about 30 feet and looked at me, then at the terrain around us, then back at me. "Fletcher?" she said. "Yes," I said. "Kessler." She closed the distance and we shook hands. Her grip was matter of fact, not performative. "Yvonne says you found the logbook," she said. "Yes." "And the 3rd level?" "Yes, though it's empty." She nodded. "It was emptied in 2003. Someone went back and cleared it out. Not us. We didn't know about the 3rd level until she started decoding the facility plans." She paused. "Someone else knew." "Who?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a bound document, printed, spiral bound. The kind of thing you make when you're putting information together for multiple people to use. She held it out. "This is everything we have from my grandmother's archives," she said. "The full documentation, not just the fieldwork, the correspondence, the reports that were denied submission, and the identity of the program that ran the study, and that has been running it, in various forms, since 1989. I took the document. "Running it," I said, "as in, it didn't stop." "The research didn't stop," she said. "It moved. It went dark. It had a new name every 4 or 5 years. And 3 months ago, something in that research went catastrophically, irreversibly wrong." The morning light was bright and cold on the ridge. Somewhere below us, in the spruce forest, a crow was making noise. The outbreak was an accident, I said. It wasn't exactly a question. Part of it, she said. The initial release was accidental. What happened after? The speed of it, the spread? That was the pathogen doing what the pathogen was designed to do. What my grandmother identified in 1987 was already a modified organism. What was released 3 months ago was 40 years of further modification. She looked at the document in my hands. The characteristics you've been observing in infected individuals, the loss of higher cognition, the retention of locomotion and prey drive, the rapid transmission through biological contact, those aren't natural disease features. They're engineered features. I stood on the ridge with the document in my hands and processed that. Why are you telling me this? I said, instead of keeping it, using it as leverage. She looked at me with something that wasn't quite impatience, but was in that neighborhood. Because 47 people in a cave are not going to rebuild anything, she said. And because what my grandmother spent her career trying to get someone to listen to is not useful sitting in a cave. It needs infrastructure. It needs communication capacity. It needs, she gestured toward the south, toward the facility I'd been living in. It needs a radar station. I thought about RD writing in her logbook in 1987, writing it carefully, hiding it in a wall. There may be others, I said. Organized resistance. We've been picking up signals. So have we, she said. It's not coming from a military installation. It's coming from 3 separate private facilities that have been coordinating since week 2. She paused. One of them is within 200 miles of here. They've been trying to reach this facility specifically because they know what Ridgeline was used for, and they think whatever documentation existed might still be here. The 3rd level, I said. Whatever was in the 3rd level, she agreed, which is gone. But the full archives, she nodded toward the document in my hands, are not. I walked back to the facility in the early afternoon with Kessler's document in my pack and a lot to think about. The question that had been forming since roughly week 3, stay hidden inside the fortress or follow the transmission, had just gotten more complicated. Not in the direction of impossible, but in the direction of larger. The choice wasn't simply whether to leave the safety of the facility for the uncertainty of the unknown. The choice was whether to become part of something that might actually matter, beyond just keeping a small group of people alive in a hardened structure in the Montana backcountry. I walked back through the terrain I'd walked through dozens of times now. The rock outcroppings above the spruce belt, the meadow crossing I'd learned to do at the north end where it was narrowest, the last half-mile along the ridge toward the access track. And I thought about RD. She'd been a military scientist in 1987, working on something she hadn't fully consented to or understood when she started. And at some point, she'd understood it enough to be frightened. Frightened enough to hide documentation in a wall, to write warnings that she thought might never be read. I'd read them. Her granddaughter had read them. And now, because of the specific chain of events that had led me to buy this facility, and the specific knowledge that had made me fortify it before the outbreak, and the specific people who had found their way here, we had the documentation, and the infrastructure, and the communication capacity, and the medical expertise, and enough supplies to actually do something with all of it. That felt like something more than coincidence without feeling like destiny. It felt more like, all of these things happened and here we are, and what do we do with that? When I got back to the gate, Donna was waiting for me. She looked at my face when I came through the gate and said, "You look like someone who just got a lot of information." "I did," I said. "Good information or complicated information?" "Both," I said. "Both at the same time." The planning took 8 days. 8 days of documents spread across the folding tables in the 2nd level, of Walt cross-referencing signal patterns with the coordinates in the Kessler documentation, of Donna and Pete running the supply numbers for a combined group and a first transfer operation, of Yvonne, fully in now, no more in between, describing the cave system's layout and access points and the specific individuals whose skills mattered most. I want to describe those 8 days as productive and purposeful, which they were, but what I remember most viscerally is how tired I was through all of it. Not sleepy exactly, More like the specific tiredness that comes when you've been running on compressed adrenaline for weeks, and you finally have a project big enough to put your energy into, and your body suddenly wants to know if maybe you could also just rest for 5 minutes. I didn't rest much. What came out of those 8 days, in practical terms? A plan for a water filtration system transfer to Birch Cave, portable equipment from our stores, combined with parts we'd source from the auto parts store in Qatar on a second supply run. We could have working filtration to them within a week of making the decision. A supply convoy plan. 3 vehicles. I had my truck, Donna had her F-250, and Walt had his pickup. With the 3 vehicles and careful loading, we could transfer essential supplies to the cave in a single run, while maintaining 2 weeks of buffer stores at the facility. A communication setup. Walt would wire a secondary radio relay to a point on the northeast ridge, a simple installation that would let the cave and the facility communicate without either group having to make the full trip between them. This was the highest priority in his mind, and I agreed. And a third element that was harder to plan for, making contact with the coordinating facilities that Kessler had told me about, the ones that had been trying to reach Ridgeline Station. This last part required a decision that I want to be honest about. I was afraid of it. Not the physical risk of transmitting, though there was risk in that, but the commitment it represented. Once we made contact with a larger organized network, we were no longer just a small group trying to survive. We were part of something, and being part of something meant responsibility for things I couldn't fully control or predict. I sat with that for a while. Then I thought about RD again, about the kinds of choices she must have faced, understanding something important and having 2 options. Tell someone, or don't. She'd told someone. It hadn't worked the way she hoped, but the knowledge hadn't died with her. I decided to transmit. Walt composed the first transmission carefully, and I approved every word of it, because we both understood that what we said in that first contact would set the terms for everything that followed. The message we sent was concise. It identified the facility by its official designation, RFS 19, Ridgeline Station. It stated that the facility was active and occupied. It stated that we had the RD archives from the 1987 study and were in coordination with the Birch Cave Survivor Group. It requested authentication of the receiving party's identity and status before further information sharing, and it provided a specific follow-up frequency and time. We transmitted at 0200 hours to reduce the chance of the signal being tracked by hostile parties. The paramilitary group was a real concern, and I'll get to that in a moment. And we kept the transmission under 60 seconds. The reply came back 40 minutes later. It was authenticated in a way that meant nothing to me, but everything to Walt and Kessler. A specific response protocol that matched something in RD's archives. A code phrase that wouldn't mean anything to someone who didn't have the documents. The reply identified the sending station as one located in Idaho and stated that 2 other stations were copying the exchange. It stated that the archive material we held was, quote, the most significant documentation currently in existence regarding the origin and characteristics of the current infection, and requested an immediate secure channel for data transfer. It also said something that I hadn't expected. Ridgeline Station. We have been unable to contact 3 of our original 7 coordination nodes in the past 12 days. Communication failure or hostile action. We don't know which. We are operating on the assumption that hostile elements aware of the archive materials may be actively targeting coordination nodes. Please assess your current security status and advise. The paramilitary group. I should have mentioned them earlier in this account, but I was saving it because it requires context that only makes sense here. About 3 weeks into the occupation, Pete had found, on one of his slow facility walkabouts, a section of the outer fence on the southwest side where someone had carefully bent back 2 links of the chain and then bent them back again. Not damage, repair. Someone had made a small access point and then closed it up after they'd used it. I'd known at the time that the access was concerning. It meant someone had been inside the outer fence line before Donna and Walt and Yvonne arrived, but I hadn't been able to determine who or when, and with everything else I was managing, I'd put additional monitoring on that section of fence and filed the question for later. Later came in week 6. when I found 2 spent cartridge casings on the ground near the inner fence on the north side. 5.56 by 45 millimeter AR platform rounds. They were old enough, weeks, not days, that they were partially ground into the mud, and I'd walked past them on previous perimeter walks without noticing. Someone had been outside the inner fence, inside the outer fence, with an AR platform rifle. Not recently, but before I was watching that area carefully. I told the group that evening. What Yvonne said, when I told them, changed the picture significantly. She said that the group in Birch Cave had been aware of another survival group operating in the general area, not the cave, not my facility, that had begun, by week 3 of the outbreak, to exhibit the kind of organization and aggression that was less about survival and more about resource acquisition. They'd approached the cave entrance in week 4 in a vehicle convoy with visible weapons and asked, not entirely politely, who was in charge and what supplies were on hand. Kessler had sent a spokesman out while everyone else went silent and dark inside. The spokesman had told them the cave was an empty shelter, with no sustainable supply base. They'd looked at the entrance, done some kind of calculation, and driven on. How many? I said. The convoy had 4 vehicles, Yvonne said. Estimated 12 to 15 people. Minimum. She paused. They had 2 vehicles with military markings. Stripped down, no insignia, but the vehicle type was military. Some of the people had equipment that read as private military contractor rather than military. PMC remnants, or a PMC adjacent group. Someone who'd had access to military equipment before the outbreak and had organized quickly when things fell apart. And they'd already been inside my outer fence before I'd noticed. The question was whether they knew about the archives, and how they knew about the facility. Kessler, when I told her this through the communication relay Walt had installed, said it clearly. They know about the facility. They don't know about the archives. The people who originally ran the post-1987 program knew about this facility, and the 3rd level. We believe they're who emptied it in 2003. If there are PMC-adjacent survivors with ties to that program, they'll assume the documentation was removed in 2003, along with everything else. Which means they want the facility for the equipment, I said, not the information. Probably, she said, but if they find out about the archives, they'll want both. Yes. The security reassessment after that conversation took 2 days. I went through everything. The outer perimeter, the inner fence, the gate mechanism, the access points I knew about, and the ones I'd found but hadn't fully secured. I identified 4 locations along the outer fence that showed signs of monitoring, small depressions in the ground near the fence line that were consistent with someone lying in a prone position for an extended period, not random. Positioned at the compass points, with clear sight lines to the facility's approach routes. They'd been watching the facility, systematically, from inside the outer perimeter. I added a second ring of the bell wire trip system along the outer fence, running it continuously, rather than just on the priority sides. I moved the generator cycle to fully randomized hours, and dropped the maximum run duration to reduce the sound profile. I installed additional locks on the access hatches to both underground levels. And I made a decision about the archives. The physical document Kessler had given me was vulnerable to fire, to flood, to physical seizure. The information in it, RD's decades of documentation, the correspondence, the research conclusions, existed in only one place if you didn't count whatever copy Kessler had kept in the cave. I spent 3 nights digitizing it, photographing every page, building a compressed file, encrypting it in a way that required a key only Walt and Kessler held in their heads. Then I transmitted the encrypted file to the Idaho station over several separate sessions, small chunks at a time, to limit any individual transmission's duration. When the last chunk was confirmed received, I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was held. Whatever happened to this facility, or to the documents in it, the information wasn't going to die in a wall in Montana. The morning we left started with fog. Dense, ground-hugging fog that reduced visibility to maybe 30 yards in the valley below the facility and cut the usual morning observations significantly. I stood on the observation post looking out at whiteness and thought, this is either ideal or a problem. The fog would hide our departure from anyone watching the facility. It would also hide anything moving through the terrain around us. We went over the plan one final time at the breakfast table. Donna and Pete were going directly to Birch Cave with the water filtration equipment and the first round of supply transfer. They'd made this run twice already in the prep phase, carrying equipment to points along the route that had been staged for final transport. They knew the route. The cave group would meet them at the mouth. Walt was staying at the facility. This was his call, and I respected it. He said he was too old for field operations, and his value was in the monitoring and communication work, and he was right on both counts. He also said, and this was what really decided it, that if we all left the facility and it was taken by the PMC group while we were gone, we'd lose the communication infrastructure. Someone needed to hold the station. Yvonne was coming with me. Not to Birch Cave, somewhere else. The coordinates in the coordinating network's transmissions had recently included something new, a specific location for what they were calling a forward coordination point. Not a major installation, more like a relay, a place where representatives from multiple survivor groups had agreed to meet physically for the first time. It was about 60 miles southeast of Ridgeline, at a location the message had described as a secondary commercial structure that I'd been working to identify, but hadn't fully confirmed. I was going to that meeting, and I was taking Yvonne because she was useful in the field in ways I was still figuring out, and because I needed someone who could communicate with Birch Cave through the relay if things on my end became complicated. The decision to leave the facility was the hardest single choice I'd made through all of this. Not because leaving was obviously wrong, it wasn't, and the practical reasoning for the meeting was solid, but because the facility was the thing I'd built, the thing I'd calculated, the thing I'd been right about. Leaving it felt like releasing a very tight grip on the one certainty I'd maintained since the beginning. I stood at the gate in the fog with the truck loaded and the engine running, and I looked at the facility for a while. Walt was in the upstairs window of the operations building. He gave me a brief nod. I got in the truck. The drive southeast was 60 miles that took most of the day. Not because the roads were bad, though some of them were, but because we moved carefully, stopped to listen before every long open stretch, scouted ahead on foot twice when the road entered areas with reduced sight lines, bypassed one stretch entirely when I spotted a vehicle across the road about a half-mile ahead that was sitting at an angle, suggesting it wasn't just abandoned, but deliberately positioned. Yvonne was a good travel partner in the specific sense that she was quiet when quiet was useful, and said things when things needed saying, and understood the difference. She'd been in contact with Birch Cave through the handheld and the relay, and at intervals she relayed updates to me. Donna and Pete had reached the cave mouth by midday. The water filtration setup was operational by early afternoon. The cave group was organized, and the transfer was going smoothly. We reached the 60-mile mark, a secondary highway rest area that had been modified in ways I hadn't anticipated and didn't expect, at late afternoon. The rest area had been heavily worked, a ring of vehicles around the perimeter, sandbag positions, a flag on the main structure that wasn't any national flag, just a plain gray rectangle, the kind of signaling device that means occupied by people you're meant to find if you're looking. 3 people came out when I pulled into the outer ring, 2 men and a woman, armed but not pointing anything at me. One of the men was young, early 20s, and seemed to be the one in charge of the outer security rotation. The woman was older and had the bearing of someone who runs things. She looked at me when I got out of the truck and she said, "Fletcher?" I said yes. She said, "I'm Halcott. We've been waiting for this." She glanced at the truck and then at me and said, "You have the document." I patted the pack on my shoulder. She nodded once. Then she said, "Come inside. There's a lot you need to know, and some of it's going to change what you thought you understood about what's happening. What happened inside that building over the next 4 hours is where I've been spending a lot of my processing time ever since. I'm not going to write it all in one block because it doesn't work that way. It came out in pieces, from multiple people, building a picture that kept revising itself as new elements were added. Here's what I understood by the time I drove back north. The outbreak was, as Kessler had told me, not entirely accidental. The initial release 3 months ago was a containment failure. Genuine accident in the mechanical sense. But the pathogen that escaped was one that had been actively developed through a program that had run continuously since the late 1980s, under several different names and institutional covers, always classified above the level where normal oversight could see it. The people running the program had not anticipated the full spread rate. Their models had predicted a more localized event that could be managed. The models were wrong by several orders of magnitude. This meant two things for the current situation. First, someone who understood the pathogen's engineered characteristics also understood its specific vulnerabilities. RD's research had documented those vulnerabilities in 1987, before the modification cycle had gone as far as it had. But the structural vulnerabilities in the early version were almost certainly still present in the current one because they were foundational to the design. Exploiting those vulnerabilities, finding and weaponizing whatever would disrupt the pathogen's behavioral modification mechanism was theoretically possible. Second, the people who had run the program were still alive, or some subset of them were, and they were not organized for rebuilding but for consolidation, acquiring resources, establishing control, positioning themselves to emerge from the crisis with leverage. The PMC adjacent group I'd observed near Ridgeline was connected to this network, a peripheral element, a resource acquisition team operating under vague guidance rather than formal command. They hadn't been sent after the archive specifically, but if they'd secured Ridgeline Station and found the hidden logbook, they would have connected it to things they already knew, and they would have acted. The coordinating network that had been transmitting wasn't a formal resistance. It was loose. 7 stations, down to 4 by the time of our meeting, each one a small group with specific capabilities, loosely coordinated through radio communication and the motivation to be part of something larger than just individual survival. Halcott laid out what she thought a combined effort could accomplish. Her language was careful. She was not a military person or a scientist. She was a structural engineer from Boise who had gotten into this through a set of circumstances she summarized quickly without self-pity. And she was precise about what was possible versus what was speculative. The precision was reassuring. "We can't reverse this," she said plainly at one point. "Whatever this thing is, it's in the population, and there's no mechanism anyone here can see for a reversal. What we can work toward is suppression, behavioral disruption, finding the vulnerability in the modification mechanism, and developing something we can deploy at scale." She paused. "For which we need the archive, for which we need Kessler's group, and for which we need a location with secure infrastructure, communication capacity, and enough defensible space to operate without constant threat." She looked at me when she said that last part. I thought about the second underground level, the air handling system, the deep well, the 18-inch concrete walls. "How many people are we talking?" I said. "Best case? All 4 remaining stations, Kessler's group, what you have at Ridgeline. That's somewhere between 80 and 100 people." I thought about food stores, water capacity, generator fuel, medical supplies. "It's tight," I said. "It is," she said. "But it works," I said. She nodded. "If we're disciplined, it works." I drove back north through the dark, taking the long way around the stretch of road I'd bypassed going south. Yvonne was asleep in the passenger seat by midnight. She'd been awake for most of the previous night running communications. The road was empty, and the sky was clear, and the mountains were shapes against a sky that had too many stars because there were no city lights anywhere for hundreds of miles. I thought about what I was going to say to Donna and Walt and Pete when I got back. I thought about the conversation I was going to need to have with Kessler through the relay, about the transition of Birch Cave's group to the facility. I thought about the logistics of 80 to 100 people in a facility designed for 15, and how you feed them and house them, and keep them functional, and keep the interpersonal fabric together when you've got that many people from that many different circumstances pressed into a hardened concrete structure in the mountains. I thought about RD, writing in her logbook in the same underground room I was now using as my living space, writing about things she'd observed and couldn't get anyone to take seriously, hiding the documentation so it would survive. It had survived. 39 years later, it was in the hands of people who were going to use it. I don't know what she expected when she wrote those final entries. I don't know if she thought anyone would ever find it, but she put it there anyway. That felt like something. When I got back to the facility at 4 a.m., Walt was awake. He was at the monitoring bench with coffee, because Walt was always at the monitoring bench with coffee. And when I came in, he looked up and read my face, the way he'd gotten good at, and said, simply, "You're bringing people here." "Yes," I said. He nodded. "A lot?" 80 to 100 is the plan." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll need to run more antenna wire. The current setup isn't going to cover what we'll need for that group's communication requirements." That was it. That was his response to the most significant logistical and strategic shift since the outbreak started. More antenna wire. I sat down at the table and picked up his coffee, because mine wasn't made yet, and said, "There's more. About the pathogen. About who made it." He listened to all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a while, in the way he got quiet when he was actually processing rather than just pausing. Then he said, "RD's documentation, the vulnerability information." "Yes. It's been transmitted to the Idaho station?" "Encrypted, both keys required." He nodded slowly. "So the information exists in multiple places and can't be held by any one group. That was the idea." He looked at his coffee. "She'd have liked that," he said. "RD. She'd have liked that the information couldn't be buried." I sat with that for a while. Outside, in the early pre-dawn, I could hear the wind picking up from the northwest. The perimeter lights on the south side swayed slightly. The facility was quiet. Underground, Donna and Pete were asleep in the bunks I'd set up for them when they returned from Birch Cave. In 11 days, if everything went according to plan, the first group from the cave would arrive. In 3 weeks, the coordinating stations to the south and east would send representatives. The facility would begin its transition from one person's solitary defensive position to something that looked, however imperfectly, like an actual community. I would lose a lot of control in that transition. I'd gained a lot of control over the past months by being alone and having exactly one person's preferences and safety to manage. And now I was agreeing to be responsible for 100 people's lives in a space built for 15. That was either the bravest or the dumbest thing I'd ever done, and I genuinely couldn't tell which. I went downstairs to make coffee. I should talk about the thing at the tree line one more time, because I keep thinking about it, and because it says something about this whole experience that I want to try to articulate before I stop writing. 3 days after I got back from the coordination meeting, I was on the observation post at my usual morning time, and I looked northeast, out of habit, the way I'd been looking for months, and the thing at the tree line wasn't there. I looked for a while, scanned the tree line in both directions, checked the usual spot twice. Gone. It had been there for over a month. Every morning, in that spot, doing nothing, and now it wasn't. I don't know where it went. It might have wandered into the spruce forest and found something that drew it away. It might have followed a sound toward the valley. It might have just walked until it walked into something it couldn't walk out of. There's no understanding these things that goes very deep. They're not following a plan. They're just responding to whatever they can sense. And when the stimulus changes, the behavior changes, and there's no one inside making decisions about it. But I'd been watching that thing for so long that its absence felt like something. Not a mystery exactly, more like a reminder. Everything that seems permanent isn't. Everything that seems fixed can shift. The thing you spend weeks watching and worrying about can just be gone one morning without explanation. I stood at the observation post for a while, looking at the empty tree line. Then I went downstairs and started making the list of things we needed to do to get the facility ready for 80 people. The last thing I'll write in this account, because at some point you have to stop recounting and start doing, is about the morning we opened the gate for the first group from Birch Cave. It was a Wednesday in early spring. The fog had lifted by 8 in the morning, and the light was the specific sharp gold white of a mountain morning after a clear night. The kind of light that makes the terrain look like something out of a photograph of a place where things are fine. The spruce trees were visible all the way to the ridge. The mountains behind them were white and still. I stood at the gate with Donna on my left and Walt on my right, and Pete, who had grown about an inch in the past 2 months, and stood straighter than he had when he arrived, just behind us. The first vehicle in the convoy from Birch Cave came over the ridge and down the access track at about 8:20. It was a battered pickup loaded with people and supplies and 3 dogs. Apparently they had 3 dogs, which nobody had mentioned, and the 3 dogs were extremely interested in the facility, and in Pete specifically, who immediately started talking to them in the specific way of someone who'd been missing animals without knowing they were missing animals. Kessler got out of the second vehicle and walked to the gate and looked at the facility the same way she'd looked at me on the ridge. Direct, assessing, not performing any particular emotion. She said, "My grandmother was here for 3 months in 1987. I said, "I know. I've read the logbook." She nodded. She looked at the operations building and the perimeter lights and the 2 fences and the observation post where I'd spent so many hours, watching nothing and waiting. "It's better than I expected," she said. "It's not finished," I said. "Not even close." "No," she said, "but it's real." I opened the gate. 43 people came through in the next 40 minutes. They came with their specific weights of what they'd been through, the cave and the water and the months underground, and whatever they'd each carried in from before. And they walked through the gate into the facility and started the process of occupying it in the way that people occupy a space when they mean to stay. It was loud in a way the facility hadn't been since I'd owned it. Voices and footsteps and the dogs being excessively enthusiastic about everything. The quiet I'd been living inside for months broke open and became something else. I watched it happen from just inside the gate, the last person in from outside. I thought about the day I'd stood in the second-level alcove with the empty equipment case and the logbook in my hands, feeling the weight of what RD had left behind. I thought about the night in February, when I'd heard the broadcast change tone and known the thing I'd been half preparing for was real. I thought about the minivan at the gate in those first days, and the choice I'd made, and the weight of that choice. None of it resolved cleanly. None of it added up to a lesson that fit into a sentence. What I could say was that the things I'd done, the preparation, the fortification, the discipline of the routine, the decisions to open the gate when I did, and to whom, the decision to walk north to that ridge and east to that rest stop, those things had mattered, not because of any single brilliant choice, but because of the accumulation of them, and because I'd been present enough in each moment to make them. That's not an inspiring conclusion, but it's an honest one. I closed the gate behind me and walked into the facility. Somewhere in the operations building, Pete was laughing at something one of the dogs was doing. Walt was already buttonholing a man from Birch Cave, who turned out to be the group's radio operator, starting a technical conversation that was going to last for hours. Donna was directing 2 people from the cave group through the underground stairwell, showing them the second level, talking supplies and medical inventory in the specific efficient way she had. The monitoring receiver in the upstairs room was cycling through its frequencies, still picking up the coordinating stations, still tracking the pattern of the world outside. I stood in the equipment barn and let myself hear all of it for a moment. Then I picked up a wrench and went to check on the generator. Some days later, I'm not sure exactly how many because I've stopped counting the way I used to, I found myself back at the observation post at the usual early morning time. The tree line was empty where the thing used to stand, had been empty for weeks. The spruce forest was dark and still, in the pre-light, and above it, the mountains were the cold blue color of things that exist beyond the scale of what's currently happening. Somewhere below me in the facility, 81 people were asleep or beginning to wake up. In 3 days, a vehicle from the Idaho station was going to arrive carrying equipment and people and information we didn't have yet. The work to make this place capable of what it needed to be capable of was going to take months more, maybe longer. I put the binoculars down. The sky to the east was beginning to show the first gray suggestion of the day. Just a thinning. Not yet light, but not as dark as it had been. I stood there and watched it come.